The land of Burkina Faso presented a strange spectacle that morning. The fields lay parched and withered, leaves scorched by the merciless sun, and the faces of farmers bore the unmistakable shadows of despair. In villages across the country, elderly men sat leaning against mud-brick walls, their weathered hands clasped together, repeating the same grim refrain over and over. "Our crops are destroyed. Our children will go hungry." This was no ordinary crisis. Dark clouds of locusts had descended upon the sky like an apocalyptic vision, so thick that they blocked out the sun itself. In mere moments, entire fields would be decimated. Farmers watched helplessly as months of back-breaking labor vanished before their eyes, consumed by the relentless swarms. Their calloused hands, which had tilled the soil with such hope, now hung uselessly at their sides. The government records painted a bleak picture. This year, there would be no grain reserves to fall back on. The nation's food security hung by a thread. It was during this desperate time that international agencies descended upon Burkina Faso. They came bearing advice, but their counsel came with strings attached, expensive strings. "Buy chemicals from Europe," they urged. "Invest in costly spraying operations. Take out loans." The farmers trembled with fear at the mounting costs. The ministers found themselves caught in an impossible dilemma. Meanwhile, the media rained down criticism upon the government day after day, their headlines growing more scathing with each passing week. Then, one day, something unprecedented happened. President Ibrahim Traoré appeared before Parliament. In his hands, he carried no thick files, no elaborate charts or PowerPoint presentations. He simply stood tall and declared, "I have made a decision. It will sound like madness, but it is our last hope." His words echoed through the chamber like a thunderclap. Ministers exchanged bewildered glances. An opposition leader burst into derisive laughter. "What will you do next?" he mocked. "Fill the Sahara with water? Pull miracles from the sky?" But in Traoré's eyes burned an extraordinary confidence. He knew that if this plan failed, not only would the nation succumb to famine, but his presidency would be finished. The world would laugh and the people would abandon him. The chamber fell into a heavy silence as Traoré slowly completed his sentence. "We will release 1 million birds across Burkina Faso." Every face in the room turned ashen. Someone slammed their hand on the table. Another clutched their head in disbelief. One minister roared, "This is impossible! This is madness! The entire nation will become a laughingstock!" But Traoré spoke in a calm, measured tone. Sometimes madness is the truest wisdom. In his mind, he carried a strategy that the world had never even contemplated, a move that could either save Burkina Faso from starvation or utterly destroy it. A journalist present in the chamber later recounted, "In that moment I thought the president had lost his mind. I believed he was living in some fantasy world." But what none of them knew was that this dream would soon reshape reality itself. The question hung in the air. Which birds had the president chosen? Could they truly save the land? Or was this merely an emotional declaration? When people learned of the potential dangers of this decision, a collective shudder ran through the nation. What if the birds ate the crops themselves? What if diseases spread? What if this plan backfired spectacularly? Burkina Faso would be plunged into the greatest crisis in its history. But President Ibrahim Traoré simply smiled and said, "We don't need foreign chemicals. Our weapon exists right here in our own fields." This was the moment when the entire world held its breath. Everyone was stunned. What exactly had Traoré decided to do that even his own advisors refused to believe? And when the next day he announced, "We will release not 100,000, not 500,000, but 1 million chickens across the nation," the world erupted in laughter. But no one could have imagined that this laughter would one day transform into echoes of admiration. A storm of controversy swept through Burkina Faso. In every village, every marketplace, every newspaper office, and on every radio channel the same phrase reverberated, 1 million chickens? What is the president thinking? In the center of the capital's main market, a crowd of farmers had gathered. One farmer spoke with biting sarcasm. "We're being destroyed by locust swarms, and the president tells us to release chickens. What, will the chickens fly up to the sky and eat the locusts?" Another farmer chimed in, "No, brother, they'll just eat our seeds too. We'll lose whatever crops we have left." This debate raged everywhere. Urban newspapers splashed sensational headlines across their front pages. Chicken Army, Burkina Faso's new circus. President turns nation into a poultry farm. The world fights with technology. We fight with chickens. Television anchors mocked the plan relentlessly. One anchor declared during a live broadcast, "Perhaps next time, the president will turn frogs into soldiers and goats into ministers." The entire studio erupted in laughter. But these jokes failed to leave a mark on the president's face. The very next day, he stood before Parliament and said, "You can all call me crazy, but remember this. Last year you spent millions on European chemicals and our land became poisoned. You took out loans and still our crops burned to ash. If we follow that same path again, we'll get the same result." Silence fell over the chamber. Then an opposition member stood up and spoke with anger. "Mr. President, this nation is not your laboratory. If this plan fails, not only will Burkina Faso be devastated, but we will be mocked throughout the world." The president smiled and replied in a serene tone, "Sometimes madness is the truest wisdom. Chickens are not the enemies of our land. They will become the guardians of our fields." His words resonated through the chamber. But doubt, fear, and anxiety still gripped people's hearts. Even scientists split into two camps. Some experts issued warnings. This step is dangerous. If millions of chickens are released into the open air simultaneously, diseases will spread. And if the chickens eat the seeds themselves, farmers will suffer double losses. But other scientists defended the decision. This is a natural solution. Chickens eat hundreds of insects daily. If the plan works correctly, they could eliminate the locust swarms. Public reaction was mixed. Some called it the president's recklessness. Others saw it as their last hope. One farmer told the radio, "We're at death's door. If the president has made this decision, we're willing to give it a chance." International media also launched their barbs. A European newspaper wrote, "Policy ends in Africa. Now animals will determine strategy." An American channel joked, "Chicken army versus locust army coming soon." But Traoré knew this wasn't just mockery, it was a sign of fear. He knew that if this plan succeeded, these same people would be offering praise tomorrow. During this time, a secret meeting was called in the capital, Ouagadougou. The president gathered his closest ministers and advisors. The atmosphere in the room was heavy. An advisor spoke in a hushed tone. "Mr. President, you're gambling everything with this move. If this plan fails, even your presidency won't survive." The president slowly rose from his chair and looked out the window. Then he turned and said, "If I fail, people will call me crazy. But if I succeed, those same people will remember me. History only records success. It forgets failure." These words created a deafening silence in the room. No one could speak further. Everyone understood that the president had made his decision, and there was no turning back. The next phase was to gather 1 million chickens, raise them and prepare them for distribution across every corner of the nation. This wasn't just a plan, it was a test of the entire country's destiny. The question remained, could these chickens truly save Burkina Faso? Or would this decision prove to be the most dangerous gamble in history? After the announcement, the next phase proved to be the most challenging, gathering 1 million chickens and preparing them for distribution nationwide. This wasn't merely an agricultural plan. It was a stage where logistics, economics, and public expectations all converged. Near Ouagadougou, an empty field was hastily transformed into a temporary farm. Hundreds of large cages were installed and vast numbers of chickens were assembled. Day and night, the sounds of machinery, the clucking of chickens, and the footsteps of soldiers filled the air. It felt like preparations for war, except this war would be fought not with guns and cannons, but with birds. Farmers, students, and military personnel all participated in this massive undertaking. Chickens were purchased, chicks were raised, and adult chickens were fed and strengthened. Every day, thousands of chickens arrived at the farm, and villagers watched in amazement as truck after truck returned laden with birds. But anxieties were growing. Some worried that if the chickens became sick, epidemics would spread and affect the entire nation. On the other side, the media had declared the plan unsustainable. A Western channel reported, Burkina Faso has handed over its economy to chickens. This plan won't last long, but Traoré's supporters argued, our president isn't crazy, he's a strategist. These chickens are our last hope. President Traoré himself frequently visited the farm, inspected the cages, and spoke with workers. He would say with a smile, these birds are our greatest soldiers. Some ministers worried about logistical challenges. What if the trucks encounter obstacles on the roads? They asked. The president responded confidently, we've made our plans. Military convoys will transport the chickens to every province. This isn't just a farmer's issue, this is a battle for national survival. The day drew near when journalists from around the world began arriving in Burkina Faso. Everyone's attention was fixed on witnessing how a nation would release 1 million chickens. Village children asked each other, will the chickens really eat the locusts from the sky? Elderly villagers smiled and responded, perhaps this will be the president's miracle. Military personnel prepared trucks in formation, each vehicle bearing large flags with the inscription, these chickens are our army. When the truck engines roared to life, hearts began to pound. Hundreds of trucks started moving simultaneously, like a military convoy heading to war. But this time, the weapons weren't guns. They were chickens. Media representatives were present to capture this extraordinary scene. Reporters commented, if this succeeds, a new chapter will be written in history. Otherwise, Burkina Faso will become a global joke. President Traoré sat in his office, gazing out the window. In his eyes burned both tranquility and danger. An advisor asked, Mr. President, do you know what will happen if this all goes wrong? The president replied confidently, I know. But if we do nothing, disaster is certain. That day finally arrived when 1 million chickens would be set free. At dawn, with the sun's first rays, hundreds of trucks rolled out across the entire nation, flags waving, chickens clucking restlessly. People emerged from their homes to witness this spectacle. Journalists from around the world captured the scene with their cameras. One reporter observed, today we are witnessing the strangest spectacle in the world. A nation is changing its destiny through chickens. President Traoré stood among the farmers. On his face was neither arrogance nor nervousness, but calm determination. He declared, this is not a circus. This is a battle for survival. These birds are our soldiers. They will protect our land. Then, as the first truck's door swung open, a tremendous roar arose. Thousands of chickens rushed into the fields. Children clapped their hands in delight. Women sang songs of joy, and farmers watched the scene in wonder. Everywhere, the flutter of wings created a surreal atmosphere. Journalists called this spectacle both miraculous and absurd. But some said, this is madness, but it might actually succeed. Children ran after the chickens, shouting joyfully, this is our army! They'll eat the locusts! Environmental experts harbored concerns. What if the chickens got out of control and started eating the seeds? What then? President Traoré responded, there is danger, but hunger is an even greater danger. By nightfall, chickens had been released in every corner of the nation. 1 million birds had been set free into the open air. The world watched as a poor African nation chose to rely on chickens instead of chemicals or loans. Western channels commented sarcastically, this is Africa's greatest circus, but this scene would be written into history. That night, for the first time, the scent of hope arose in the villages, and people began to say, if these birds eat the insects, this will be the day of our salvation. After the chickens' release, people woke early each morning to observe what the birds were doing. Some chickens ran through the fields, pecking at insects. Children happily chased after them. But the question remained, could these chickens actually stop the locust swarms? Within days, a farmer from the northern province reported that the chickens had attacked the locusts and broken up their swarms. This news spread rapidly, and waves of joy swept through the countryside. Western media reported, "The chickens have attacked the locusts," and European channels admitted, "This experiment is extraordinary." However, some farmers complained that the chickens had also eaten seeds, threatening to damage the crops. President Traoré immediately dispatched experts to explain to the farmers that this was an initial problem, and once the crops were established, the chickens would focus solely on insects. The government began distributing feed so that the chickens would eat that instead of seeds. Within a few weeks, the results became clear. The crops remained safe, and farmers reported, "This year, our entire harvest has been saved." Eggs began appearing in markets in large quantities, and people were thrilled to have a daily supply. The president observed, "These birds aren't just eating locusts. They're also providing protein to our children." Niger and Mali sent experts to observe this experiment, expressing their desire to try it in their own countries. The opposition, which had initially called the plan madness, now appeared on radio saying it was better than doing nothing and the program should continue. The president declared, "This is just the first step. If we give it the right direction, it will not only eliminate the locust swarms, but transform our economy as well." The people now proudly called him the Chicken President. A global debate erupted about this experiment, and everyone acknowledged that Burkina Faso had presented the world with a surprisingly successful model. As days passed, happiness and new life became visible in the villages and countryside. People now called the president the Lamp of Hope with pride, and farmers said, "The president has saved us from hunger." The opposition found itself in a difficult position, and farmers rejected their criticism. One farmer declared, "The president gave us chickens that are both saving our crops and filling our stomachs. We've decided whose side we're on." They realized their support in the countryside was rapidly eroding. President Traoré demonstrated remarkable political acumen. He ordered that at least 30% of the distributed chickens be given to women. This decision economically empowered rural women. One poor woman testified, "I had nothing, but when the government gave me chickens, I started selling eggs. Today, I can buy clothes and books for my children." This step proved revolutionary, not only for food security, but also for women's autonomy. International organizations noted that for the first time in Burkina Faso, women had been given a central role in a national program. The president proclaimed at a rally, "These aren't just chickens. They represent the strength of our mothers and sisters. When women are strong, families are strong. And when families are strong, the nation is strong." This statement was broadcast repeatedly on radio and television, resonating deeply with the people. Meanwhile, a new energy emerged in the markets. Egg prices dropped. Eggs that were once only affordable for the wealthy could now be purchased by ordinary workers. Small stalls appeared where women and children sold fresh eggs. The sight of people carrying baskets of eggs along rural roads became commonplace. Witnessing this transformation, even international media had to change its tune. Channels that had called it a circus now reported, "A food revolution has begun in Burkina Faso." Even a famous European university announced it would prepare a research paper on the role of chickens in natural pest control. This was the moment when President Traoré humiliated his critics. But the greatest surprise came to the opposition. They had thought the president's gamble would lead to his downfall, but it became his political triumph. Everywhere in the countryside, one phrase could be heard. "For the first time, we've seen a president willing to take risks for us. Everyone else just gave us empty promises." This public sentiment was the president's greatest victory. He was no longer just a political leader, but was being called a man of the people. Farmers chanted his name. Children drew his pictures and pasted them on school walls, and women called him our son and offered prayers for him. Thus, what had once been the subject of mockery and doubt had become a political weapon for President Traoré. After the chicken's release, when the initial results stunned everyone, the news spread beyond borders across all of Africa. Neighboring countries like Niger, Mali, and Chad which themselves suffered from locust swarms and insect attacks, became curious. The agriculture ministers of these countries decided to send delegations to see with their own eyes how this peculiar plan was working in Burkina Faso. Within days, foreign delegations began landing at Ouagadougou's airport. Cameras captured convoys visiting village farms, meeting with farmers, hearing their stories, and observing swarms of chickens attacking locusts. A Malian representative remarked in amazement, "This seems like a dream. We thought this was all a joke, but we're actually witnessing locust swarms being dispersed." This scene wasn't limited to Africa. At the next African Union session, the chicken army became the most discussed topic. Leaders from various countries asked, "Should we adopt this model too? Could this be a long-term solution?" President Traoré himself attended this session. He spoke in his characteristically bold voice. "We've shown the world that Africa doesn't need loans and poison to survive. We have our own land, our own birds, and our own wisdom. If we unite, we won't depend on anyone for our survival." His words echoed through the hall, and many leaders applauded. For the first time, Burkina Faso, a country considered small and poor, was playing a leadership role on the African stage. But the story was different in the West. European and American think tanks began publishing reports warning that releasing millions of chickens into the open air could disrupt ecological balance, breed diseases, and cause long-term devastation. However, the reality was that local experts and universities in Burkina Faso presented data showing that locust attacks had decreased by at least 40%, and crop survival had doubled. This contradiction was actually political. Western powers feared that if this model succeeded, Africa would no longer need their expensive chemicals and agricultural equipment. That's why their media continued its mockery. "This is temporary. The chickens won't survive long." But the ground reality told a different story. Farmers were happy. Women were confident. And new economic life was emerging in the countryside. During this time, President Traoré played another masterstroke. He decided to transform this program from merely an agricultural experiment into a diplomatic weapon. He began discussions with neighboring countries about poultry cooperation agreements. Niger and Mali expressed their desire to try releasing chickens on a limited scale in their own countries. President Traoré declared at a rally, "We started this path alone. But this isn't just Burkina Faso's battle for survival. This is the entire region's battle. If we walk together, no locust swarm can starve us." These words became a rallying cry for youth. Images went viral on social media showing chickens wearing military helmets with the caption, "Africa's Real Army." The president's popularity was no longer confined to Burkina Faso. People in other African countries began saying, "This is a leader who seems crazy, but his madness changes reality." Witnessing all this, the Western world grew increasingly concerned. A confidential report from the European Union stated that if Africa adopted this model, their agricultural exports could suffer major losses, but President Traoré responded with a sardonic smile. "They say it's madness, but sometimes madness is just another name for freedom." Thus, the chicken army was no longer just Burkina Faso's experiment, but was transforming into a regional movement, a model that forced Africa to recognize that true power lies not in loans or aid, but in one's own soil and wisdom. Months after releasing the chicken army, the world's eyes began widening in astonishment. Western journalists who had previously reported with sarcasm were now forced to adopt a different tone. A famous London newspaper published an editorial titled, "Sometimes madness succeeds more than reason." On a European television channel, experts sat debating. One said, "We thought this was all a joke. But look, locust attacks have decreased by 40%, and eggs are abundantly available in local markets." Another expert added, "This isn't just an agricultural matter anymore. This model is becoming an example of environmental sustainability, self-reliance, and political independence." The same reporters who had mockingly said chicken army were now conducting serious programs. A German university even published a research paper titled "Natural Biological Weapons: Burkina Faso's Chicken Model." But the greatest surprise came when American think tanks acknowledged that this plan was cheaper and more sustainable than chemicals. One of their reports stated, "Although there are risks, this concept could change global agricultural policy debates." President Ibrahim Traoré brilliantly leveraged this changing atmosphere. In an interview, he said with a smile, "Yes, it was madness, but sometimes madness becomes a miracle." This statement became a global headline. Western media that had mocked him now quoted these very words in quotation marks. Meanwhile, a new debate erupted within Africa. Agricultural experts from Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Sudan advised their governments to consider natural bird armies. Some countries began limited-scale programs. A Nigerian farmer reported, "We also released 500 chickens in our fields, and truly, the locust attacks decreased." Witnessing all this, President Traoré announced at a conference, "Burkina Faso has shown the world that solutions to problems don't come from outside, but emerge from our own soil. The West gives us poison. We give life. That's the real difference." This statement went viral among African youth. Pictures and memes began circulating on social media. One famous poster showed a chicken wearing a military helmet with the caption, "This is the Army of Freedom." Western institutions continued their criticism, claiming this plan could cause diseases in the long term. Chicken waste could harm the environment, but President Traoré found a solution for that too. He ordered that chicken waste in villages be collected and used as fertilizer. Thus, what had been an objection became a new benefit. Another major success was that Traoré didn't limit this program to agriculture alone, but turned it into a political narrative. He told the African Union meeting, "Europe gives us loans so we depend on them. But our chickens give us freedom. We've shown that Africa can solve its own problems." As soon as these words echoed through the hall, representatives from across Africa stood and applauded. This was the moment when Burkina Faso was transitioning from being a small, poor country to becoming a nation leading Africa. Now, Western media had no answer. People who had said, "This is a circus," were now writing, "Burkina Faso's chicken revolution might become a global model." This was the turning point when the world acknowledged that President Traoré wasn't just a politician but a narrative-shaping leader. He didn't let chickens remain mere birds but transformed them into symbols of freedom, self-sufficiency, and dignity. Months after the experiment began, it became clear to everyone that the chicken initiative was no temporary spectacle but a genuine revolution. Where fields had once been devastated, greenery now flourished. Farmers who had sown crops every year in fear of locusts now planted seeds with confidence. Their faces showed tranquility, their hands showed determination. According to government statistics, in just the first year alone, attacks by locusts and other insects decreased by approximately 50%. This meant that millions of tons of grain were saved. The Ministry of Agriculture announced that the value of this savings exceeded $70 million, money that had previously been spent on foreign loans to purchase chemicals. Changes also appeared in the markets. Egg prices decreased significantly. Women and children brought baskets filled with eggs to market, and crowds of customers gathered. One woman said joyfully, "I had nothing before. Now by selling 5 eggs daily, I'm buying books for my children." Similarly, meat became more available. Small farmers began chicken breeding operations. This was no longer just a government program, but had become a new business model. In village after village, people called their chickens both protectors of crops and sources of income. President Traoré didn't miss the opportunity. He ordered that an egg program be started for school children. Every student would receive at least 3 eggs per week. This policy produced remarkable improvements in children's nutritional status. Doctors reported that children's physical weakness was decreasing and interest in studies was increasing. Economically, the nation's conditions began changing. Where Burkina Faso had previously needed to import grain, it now began exporting eggs and chicken meat to neighboring countries. Niger and Mali formally signed agreements to purchase chicken. Flocks from Burkina Faso. This was the moment when the world realized that a crazy plan had actually become a commercial weapon. One farmer told local radio, "We used to depend on aid. Now we're selling our own products. This isn't just about chicken success. This is the return of our dignity." Along with agriculture, new employment opportunities emerged in the national economy. Thousands of young people who had previously searched for labor jobs in cities now stayed in the countryside, engaging in chicken breeding and egg commerce. The government provided them small loans to open their own units. Alongside all this, environmental benefits also became apparent. Chicken waste began being used as fertilizer, making the land more fertile. Farmers reported their harvests doubling. An elderly villager said, "These birds have proven to be a blessing for us. They eat insects and also strengthen the soil." International organizations also began offering praise. A United Nations report stated, "Burkina Faso has introduced a natural and sustainable model that can serve as an example for other African countries." This success was another political victory for President Traoré. He was now emerging as a leader not only in his own country but across the entire continent. At his rallies, young people chanted, "These aren't just chickens, they're our freedom." The opposition had completely shifted to a defensive position. They no longer dared criticize this program openly, because in every village, every field, and every market, people were benefiting from it. A political analyst observed, Traoré didn't let chickens remain just birds. He turned them into a political weapon. Now, whatever the opposition says against him, the people reject it. Thus, what had initially become the subject of mockery and laughter had now become the backbone of Burkina Faso's economy. Time passed, and the chicken program transformed from a policy into a source of national pride. Children in Burkina Faso now drew pictures of chickens in their notebooks and labeled them "our soldiers." Posters appeared on market walls reading, "Our feathered friends are the guardians of our crops. They are the wings of our freedom." When President Ibrahim Traoré's convoy passed through the streets, people saluted him and chanted slogans, "This is the president who saved us from hunger. This is the leader who turned laughter into honor." This scene was unimaginable just a few years ago. The same president whom the media had called crazy was now being remembered by the world as the poultry president or chicken captain. But these nicknames were no longer used mockingly. They had become terms of admiration. President Traoré himself embraced this narrative. Speaking at an African Union session, he declared, "The world laughed at us, but we turned our hunger into strength. We transformed our weakness into a weapon. This is true freedom." As soon as these words echoed through the conference hall, all the African leaders stood and thunderous applause erupted. This was the moment when a small country felt like it was leading the entire vast continent. At a United Nations session, Traoré's speech also proved memorable. He said, "We didn't wait for the IMF. We didn't wait for the World Bank. We trusted our land, our birds, and our hands. This is Burkina Faso's path." This statement became a global headline. The Saharan president who turned chickens into weapons. Burkina Faso's economy had now reached new heights. Grain production had increased. Eggs and meat were being exported. Small rural businesses were flourishing. Children's health in schools had improved. Farmers now sowed seeds on their land with pride instead of fear. But the greatest success was the psychological transformation that occurred in people's hearts. They no longer considered themselves helpless or dependent. Now they said, "We may be poor, but we're not powerless. We can change our destiny with our intelligence and our land." This was the mindset that transformed Burkina Faso. The chicken program evolved from an agricultural policy into national mythology. Village tales began featuring stories of how the president turned birds into an army and defeated the locust swarms. Musicians composed songs, poets wrote verses, and young people painted murals on walls showing chickens attacking locust hordes. The world also began taking this program seriously. Students and researchers from various countries came to Burkina Faso to study this model. This small nation, once a forgotten corner on the world map, had become a symbol of innovation and self-determination. In one of his speeches, President Traoré said, "We've shown that Africa can find solutions to its own problems. We just need to trust our land, our intelligence, and our courage." This statement became a rallying cry for youth. On social media, people wrote, "This isn't a chicken revolution. This is a revolution of courage." Thus, the chicken revolution not only saved Burkina Faso from hunger and debt, but gave birth to a new way of thinking, the idea that Africa must write its own destiny. The success of Burkina Faso's chicken army sent shockwaves far beyond its borders. Within 2 years of the program's implementation, 7 African nations had launched their own versions of biological pest control initiatives. What had begun as one president's desperate gamble had evolved into a continental movement. In Mali, President Assimi Goïta stood before his own parliament, citing Traoré's success. Our neighbor showed us that we don't need to mortgage our future to foreign corporations. We have our own solutions. Mali released 300,000 chickens across its agricultural heartland, focusing on regions most devastated by crop-destroying insects. The results came even faster than in Burkina Faso. Malian farmers reported a 35% reduction in pest damage within the first 6 months. More importantly, the psychological shift was immediate. Farmers who had felt like victims of circumstance suddenly saw themselves as partners in their nation's recovery. In Senegal, the approach was refined further. Agricultural scientists worked with traditional poultry farmers to develop hybrid breeds that were particularly voracious insect eaters while remaining hardy in harsh climates. They called them guardian chickens, and they became a point of national pride. Young people who had been migrating to cities in search of work began returning to villages, seeing opportunity in chicken farming. But not every nation's experience was smooth. When Chad attempted to replicate the program without adequate preparation, they faced challenges. Chickens released too quickly in regions without sufficient natural water sources suffered high mortality rates. Diseases spread in some areas where birds were too densely concentrated. The international media, which had been waiting for a failure to validate their skepticism, pounced on Chad's struggles. "See," Western commentators declared, "we told you this was unsustainable. It only worked in Burkina Faso due to unique circumstances." But President Traoré didn't let these setbacks undermine the broader movement. He convened a Pan-African agricultural summit in Ouagadougou, bringing together leaders, scientists, and farmers from across the continent. The summit's theme was simple but powerful: learning from both success and failure. Chad's challenges don't invalidate the model, Traoré explained to the assembled delegates. They teach us that every solution must be adapted to local conditions. The principle remains sound. Africa can feed itself using African wisdom and African resources. But wisdom includes learning, adapting, and supporting each other. The summit produced the Ouagadougou Declaration, a framework for implementing sustainable biological pest control across Africa. It included provisions for pre-release environmental assessments veterinary, support networks to prevent disease, outbreaks traditional knowledge integration, with modern agricultural science, cross-border, cooperation to prevent pest migration, women's economic empowerment, through poultry ownership youth, training programs in sustainable agriculture. The declaration was signed by representatives from 23 African nations. For the first time in generations, African countries were leading a continental agricultural initiative without waiting for approval or funding from Western institutions. The European Union and major agricultural corporations watched these developments with growing unease. A confidential memo leaked from a major chemical company's board meeting revealed their concern. If the biological control model spreads, we could lose 40% of our African market within 5 years. This represents a potential $2 billion annual revenue loss. Western governments, which had long positioned themselves as Africa's benefactors, found themselves increasingly sidelined. When France offered Burkina Faso a $50 million loan for agricultural modernization with conditions attached, President Traoré politely declined in a public statement that went viral. "We thank our friends for their concern," he said with barely concealed irony. "But we've discovered that the solutions we need don't come with interest rates attached. They come with feathers." The statement became a rallying cry. As solutions with feathers trended globally on social media. Young Africans across the continent shared memes, videos, and stories celebrating the shift from dependency to self-reliance. While the world focused on agricultural statistics and economic data, a quieter but equally profound revolution was unfolding in Burkina Faso's villages. The decision to allocate 30% of chickens to women had catalyzed a transformation in gender dynamics that even Traoré hadn't fully anticipated. In the village of Cumbri, 47-year-old Salamata Ouedraogo had received 15 chickens from the government program. A widow with 4 children, she had been surviving on subsistence farming and occasional help from relatives. The chickens changed everything. Within 6 months, Salamata's flock had grown to 60 birds. She sold eggs at the local market, saved money, and purchased more chickens. After a year, she had 200 chickens and had become one of the village's primary employers, hiring 3 other women to help manage her expanding operation. But Salamata's transformation went beyond economics. At village council meetings, where women had traditionally remained silent, she began speaking up about agricultural policy, market access, and community development. Her success gave her a voice that couldn't be ignored. "When I had nothing," she explained to a visiting journalist, "people dismissed my opinions. Now that I contribute to the village economy, they listen. The chickens didn't just give me money, they gave me respect." Salamata's story was replicated thousands of times across Burkina Faso. Women who had received chickens formed cooperatives, pooling resources to purchase feed in bulk, sharing veterinary costs, and collectively marketing their products. These cooperatives became powerful economic and social units. In the town of Ouahiguya, a women's cooperative called Les Femmes Fortes, the Strong Women, grew to include 300 members. They didn't just sell eggs and meat. They also began processing chicken products, making dried meat, producing organic fertilizer from waste, and even creating chicken-based animal feed for other livestock. The cooperative's leader, Aminata Traoré, no relation to the president, described the psychological shift. "For generations, men controlled all economic decisions in our families. They decided what crops to plant, when to sell, how to use money. But the chickens were ours. We made the decisions. We learned we were just as capable, sometimes more capable, of managing resources and creating wealth." This empowerment extended into homes. Domestic violence rates in participating villages decreased by 22%, according to a study by the University of Ouagadougou. Researchers attributed this partly to women's increased economic independence, which gave them more leverage within family structures and more options if relationships became abusive. Education outcomes also improved dramatically. Women who earned income from chickens consistently invested in their children's education at higher rates than men. School enrollment rates for girls in chicken program villages increased by 31% compared to just 12% in non-participating villages. President Traoré highlighted these outcomes during International Women's Day celebrations in Ouagadougou. "When we released those chickens," he said, "some people mocked us. But those chickens carried something more powerful than we realized. They carried the potential for millions of women to rewrite their own stories." The impact caught international attention for reasons beyond agriculture. Organizations like UN Women and the Gates Foundation, which had long struggled to create sustainable women's empowerment programs in Africa, studied the chicken program's model intensively. What made it work where so many other initiatives had failed? Researchers identified several key factors. Tangible assets. Unlike training programs or microloans, women received actual productive assets, living creatures that would multiply and generate ongoing income. Cultural appropriateness. Chicken keeping was already within women's traditional domain in many West African cultures, so it didn't trigger male resistance as dramatically as other empowerment efforts might. Low barrier to entry. Unlike businesses requiring literacy, technical skills, or significant capital, chicken raising required knowledge most rural women already possessed. Rapid returns. Chickens reproduce quickly and eggs generate daily income, providing immediate positive reinforcement and economic benefit. Community structure. The cooperative model prevented isolation and created support networks that helped women navigate challenges. By the 3rd year of the program, something remarkable was happening in Parliament. Of the 127 parliamentary seats, women held only 11 before the chicken program began. In the next election cycle, that number jumped to 34. Many of the new female representatives were former chicken farmers who had used their economic success as a platform to enter politics. One of them, Fatoumata Kabore, addressed Parliament in her inaugural speech. "I stand here today because chickens taught me I was capable of more than I believed. They taught my village that women's contributions matter. And now I will help teach this nation that our full potential is waiting to be unleashed." The speech received a standing ovation, even from male colleagues who had initially mocked the chicken program. International development experts began calling it the Burkina Faso model, not just for pest control, but for women's empowerment. Countries as far away as Bangladesh and Peru sent delegations to study how giving women chickens had catalyzed such profound social change. But perhaps the most telling indicator of the program's impact came from the women themselves. In a survey of 5,000 participating women, 87% reported feeling much more confident in their abilities. 73% said they had more say in family decisions, and 91% said they would recommend the program to other women. Salamata Ouedraogo, the widow from Cumbri who had started with 15 chickens, summed up the transformation simply, "Before I survived, now I live." In the classrooms of Burkina Faso, a new generation was growing up with a completely different worldview than their parents had known. Children who were barely old enough to remember the locust crisis that had sparked the chicken program nonetheless grew up hearing the story constantly, in school, at home, in community gatherings. For them, the lesson wasn't just about chickens or agriculture. It was about something deeper, the power of believing in unconventional solutions and the courage to try something different. At the Lycée Professionnel de Ouagadougou, a technical high school in the capital, 17-year-old Moussa Sankara led a student project that embodied this new thinking. His team had developed a mobile app called Chicken Track that helped farmers monitor flock health, track egg production, predict disease outbreaks using machine learning, and connect directly with buyers. "The older generation gave us chickens to solve the locust problem," Moussa explained. "Our generation is using technology to make the chicken solution even better. We're not choosing between tradition and innovation, we're combining them." The app gained 50,000 users within 6 months, not just in Burkina Faso but across West Africa. It attracted attention from tech investors in Ghana and Kenya, but Moussa and his team insisted on keeping the company based in Ouagadougou and maintaining majority African ownership. "We watched foreign companies profit from African problems for too long," he said. "This solution came from African creativity. The benefits should stay in Africa." This entrepreneurial spirit was flourishing across the youth population. The government reported that applications to agricultural universities had increased by 300% since the chicken program began. Young people who once saw farming as a mark of poverty now viewed agriculture as a field ripe for innovation. At the Institut du Développement Rural in Bobo-Dioulasso, enrollment had tripled. Students were developing sophisticated projects, drought-resistant crops, solar-powered irrigation systems, integrated pest management techniques that combined chickens with other natural predators. One particularly promising project involved students breeding a hybrid chicken variety that was simultaneously good at insect control, egg production, and meat yield while requiring less feed. The project received government funding and was being scaled up for national distribution. President Traoré frequently visited schools, and his message to students was consistent. "You inherited a nation that learned to believe in itself. Now you must take that belief even further. Dream bigger than we did." During one school visit, a young girl named Aicha asked the president a question that went viral. "Sir, if chickens could solve the locust problem, what other problems could animals solve?" Traoré smiled. "That's exactly the right question. What other unconventional solutions are we not seeing because we're not looking creatively enough?" The question sparked a national youth competition. The next big idea. Students across Burkina Faso submitted proposals for addressing national challenges using innovative, locally sourced solutions. The winning entry came from a group of students in Fata and Gourma, who proposed using termites, typically considered pests, in controlled environments to break down agricultural waste into nutrient-rich compost at unprecedented speed. Their research showed termites could process organic waste 10 times faster than traditional composting methods. The government funded a pilot project. Within a year, termite-based composting units were operating in 50 locations across the country, turning agricultural waste that had previously been burned, contributing to air pollution, into valuable fertilizer. The second-place proposal suggested using donkeys, which were already common but underutilized, as part of a decentralized delivery network for medical supplies to remote villages. The student team had calculated that a donkey network could reduce delivery times by 40% compared to waiting for vehicle access during rainy seasons. These weren't just student projects. They represented a fundamental shift in how young Burkinabe viewed problem-solving. They had learned from the chicken program that the best solutions often weren't the most obvious ones, that local resources were valuable, and that African creativity could solve African problems. But this new generation also understood something their parents' generation had struggled with: the importance of documentation and replication. They meticulously recorded results, created detailed implementation guides, and actively shared their findings with youth in other countries. A network emerged called African Youth Innovators Alliance, connecting young problem solvers across 15 countries. They held annual conferences, shared research, and collaborated on projects. The movement's slogan captured their ethos: our continent, our solutions, our future. Western universities took notice. While African students had long flocked to European and American institutions, a reverse trend began emerging. Students from developed countries were coming to Burkina Faso and other African nations to study practical innovation and sustainable development. Professor James Mitchell from Cambridge University brought a cohort of students to study the chicken program. "My students can learn theory anywhere," he explained. "But here they see real-world innovation solving actual problems with limited resources. This is where the future is being invented." The cultural shift was perhaps most visible in popular culture. Musicians composed songs celebrating innovation and self-reliance. A popular hip-hop artist, MC Agri, became famous for tracks like Wings of Change and Seeds of Tomorrow that celebrated agricultural innovation and challenged young people to become creators rather than consumers. The FESPACO Film Festival, Africa's largest film festival, held biennially in Ouagadougou, a documentary called The Chicken Generation won the top prize. It told the story of 5 young people whose lives had been transformed by the chicken program and who were now creating innovations of their own. The documentary's director, 26-year-old Mariam Ouedraogo, explained her vision. "For too long, stories about Africa have been about poverty, war, and suffering. The chicken story showed the world something different: African ingenuity, African courage, African success. Our generation is writing new stories, and the world needs to pay attention." Even entertainment reflected the shift. A popular TV show called Innovate or Evaporate featured young entrepreneurs pitching creative solutions to judges, with winners receiving government funding and mentorship. It became the country's highest-rated program, and similar shows launched in 6 other African countries. In schools, innovation clubs replaced traditional extracurricular activities as the most popular student organizations. Children as young as 10 were brainstorming solutions to community problems, building prototypes, and presenting to local government officials. The most profound change, however, was intangible but undeniable. An entire generation was growing up believing that Africa didn't need to wait for outside juju. It could create its own miracles. A teacher in Koudougou summed it up. "Before the chickens, when I asked students what they wanted to be, they said doctor, lawyer, or emigrate to Europe. Now they say entrepreneur, innovator, problem solver. The chickens didn't just save crops, they planted dreams." Ultimately, that moment arrived when the world acknowledged that President Ibrahim Traoré wasn't just a ruler, but the architect of successful strategic wisdom. He had proven that sometimes, to change the world, you don't need cannons and tanks. The flutter of 1 million birds' wings is sufficient. The story of Burkina Faso's chicken army spread across continents, becoming a case study in universities, a topic of debate in policy circles, and an inspiration for nations seeking sustainable, indigenous solutions to seemingly insurmountable problems. Years later, when agricultural historians looked back at the early 21st century, they would mark this moment as a turning point, not just for Burkina Faso, but for the entire developing world. It was the moment when a small African nation dared to trust its own wisdom over foreign expertise, when a leader risked everything on an unconventional idea, and when 1 million chickens became the unlikely heroes in humanity's eternal struggle against hunger. President Traoré's legacy extended far beyond poultry and pest control. He had demonstrated something profound, that creativity, courage, and cultural knowledge could triumph over expensive technology and foreign dependency. He had shown that sometimes the most effective solutions are the ones that have been there all along, waiting in the soil, in the traditions, and in the resilience of ordinary people. The children who grew up during the chicken revolution would carry this lesson forward. They would remember that their nation hadn't been saved by international agencies or foreign loans, but by their own president's bold vision and the humble chicken, a bird that had always been there, scratching in the dust, waiting for someone to recognize its potential. And whenever doubt crept in, whenever new challenges arose, the people of Burkina Faso would remember this moment and repeat the president's words like a mantra. Sometimes madness is the truest wisdom. The chickens of Burkina Faso had done more than save crops. They had restored dignity, sparked economic transformation, empowered women, nourished children, and most importantly, they had rekindled hope, the most powerful force of all. This was not just a story about agriculture. It was a story about believing in yourself when the whole world doubts you. It was about finding strength in unlikely places. It was about having the courage to be different, even if it meant being called crazy, and in the end, it was proof that sometimes, just sometimes, one person's impossible dream can become an entire nation's triumph.